In the aftermath of the Persian invasion of Greece, two city-states began to fill the power vacuum. Sparta, the city-state that took the principal lead against the Persians, held hegemony over the Greek world. In opposition stood Athens. In the 50 years since the city was sacked by the Persians, it had once again grown in prominence. The city controlled a vast naval empire, and its colonies were spread all around the Mediterranean world. In summary, there was a strong land-based power against a strong naval-based power. In the words of the great historian Thucydides, the growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Sparta made war inevitable. As we all know, the Peloponnesian War is what followed. While this occurred nearly 2,500 years ago in a small part of the world, the Peloponnesian War can be considered as one of the first instances of a great power conflict. This pattern of an established power being challenged for hegemony from a newer, rising power has happened many different times throughout recorded history. In 2017, Harvard professor Graham Allison recognized this and coined the term Thucydides Trap to describe such events. According to Harvard University, since the year 1492, there have been 16 instances of the Thucydides Trap occurring. Of these 16 occurrences, 12 of them turned into wars, while the other 4 turned into either cold wars or were settled via treaties to prevent conflict. Let's talk about some of these examples and look at what occurred. The first example that we have is the conflict between Portugal and Spain over their territorial claims in the New World. Portugal was the established power and Spain was the rising power. After uniting the Spanish-speaking world by completing the Reconquista, the Spanish Empire was dead set on surpassing Portugal in the early stages of colonization. It was the Spanish that funded Columbus's voyage, and they were the ones who started colonizing the Caribbean almost immediately. When the Portuguese arrived in Brazil and also started colonizing, the Spanish began to threaten war over the region. Unlike many of the conflicts after this, the Thucydides Trap was avoided due to papal interference and the subsequent Treaty of Tordesillas, a potentially devastating war that would have occurred in the New World and on the Iberian Peninsula was avoided due to a third party influencing the situation. Moving on further down the chronological line, we come to the 18th century and the early 19th century. There is one rivalry and a series of conflicts that define this era in history. The wars between France and Great Britain can be split into two different sections. The first spanning from the 9 Years' War and the American Revolution, and the second between the French and the British during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars. The French and British hegemonic rivalry matches up pretty well against the Sparta-Athens rivalry. France was a land-dominant power akin to Sparta, and Great Britain was the naval-based power akin to Athens. Both nations wanted to dominate Europe, but in different ways. Unlike the previous example between the Portuguese and Spanish, the conflicts between Great Britain and France escalated into numerous wars, culminating in the utterly devastating Napoleonic Wars. Following the absolutely resounding defeat of the French in 1815, the two nations would never again engage in a war of power between them. Instead, France and Britain would mainly fight on the same side of conflicts like in the Crimean War, World War I, and World War II. While both World War I and World War II are examples of the Thucydides Trap in effect, I think that it is important to look at the events after these two wars. We all know how truly devastating the two world wars were, in that after World War II, the geopolitical nature of the world totally changed. The important events to mention about World War II, though, are the use of the atom bomb and the subsequent proliferation of said device, and the creation of the United Nations. After the war, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, the United States, France, China, Pakistan, India, Israel, and North Korea would all get their hands on the atom bomb. These two events have an outsized effect on the Thucydides Trap going forward. At the end of this list, there are two examples of the Thucydides Trap at play. The first is the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. While this conflict did not end up with an all-out war between the two powers, there were many different proxy wars that occurred during the time. The reason a true war between the two nations was prevented was due to the presence of nuclear weapons and the United Nations diplomatic framework. This is not to say that a nuclear annihilation was off the table entirely. Look no further than the Cuban Missile Crisis for proof of that. What nuclear weapons in the United Nations did was allow for a third-party influence to provide a backstop to prevent a slide into the Thucydides Trap. Just like the previous example, the final instance of the Thucydides Trap mentioned by Allison occurred in the 90s, with the reunification and reintegration of a powerful Germany into Europe and the European Union. This time, war was prevented because of the European Union and NATO. Once again, a diplomatic backstop prevented a slide into the Thucydides Trap. All of these examples show us different dynamics that seem to be identifiers of a Thucydides Trap situation. A Thucydides Trap typically has an established great power or regional power whose dominance is threatened by a rising power, a conflict that usually involves convoluted alliance structures, either occurs when military dominance is threatened or when economic dominance is threatened, and typically the only thing that can avert a conflict is a third party intervening. I bring all of these points up because many geopolitical scholars, including Allison, make the case that we are living through another Thucydides Trap situation as we speak. This time, it is between the United States and China.